Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be entering week 7 and beginning to explore rites of passage, physical and cognitive development during adolescence. So think back, for some of you that may not be too far, but think about all those changes that happen during your adolescence years. We're going to look at cognitive, the social aspect. We're going to look at physical and think of, we have a lot of major changes going on through our adolescence years. So let's take a look and see what we're going to cover this week. So we're going to look at what physical and cognitive developments occur during adolescence. So can you think of a few? What changes take place during puberty? So puberty is a big thing for both boys and girls. We're going to go over that and how the age they go through it and how they experience things differently and how that plays a role in their development. We're going to take a look at what is needed for optimal development during adolescence. So what environment or peers or everything that is needed for optimal development. And then finally, we're going to look at how do adolescents differ from children regarding their thoughts on moral issues. So we're going to take that as our cognitive development matures, how do we look at things morally? As it becomes more complex, do we have a more complex way of thinking? So we're going to take a look at this. Let's continue on and look at the next slide. So when we think of adolescence, one of the major things that we think of is going through puberty. So we're going to begin with what are those pubertal changes? So our learning objectives are what physical changes occur during adolescence that mark the transition to a mature young adult. So think of all the physical changes that happen to males as well as females. What factors cause the physical changes associated with puberty? So we're going to learn why the physiology of it. Why do we go through puberty? What triggers it? And how does hormones and all that play a factor in it? And how do physical changes affect adolescent psychological development? So as your body changes, what does that do to your psyche? How do you form relationships? How do you look at the world? So we're going to take a look at all that as we explore the first part of chapter 8. So when we think of adolescence, one of the main things that we think of is puberty. It's one of the things that is a rite of passage from becoming a child to an adult. So what is puberty? So puberty is categorized into two types of physical changes that mark the transition from childhood to young adulthood. So we think about bodily changes and then sexual maturation. So if that was asked on a question, what is puberty? Well, you're going to do two different things. Your body's going to change and grow, and then you're going to get maturity of your sexual maturation. So what does that mean? So for bodily changes, you're going to get a growth spurt, right? So when you think of boys and girls at 11 or 12. Who tends to be the taller one? Right? We have like really tall girls, maybe shorter boys, then they get these big old growth spurts, right? They like grow over summer. So that's a form of puberty when you see those growth spurts. And then sexual maturation means growth of breast or testes. So females will start getting, their breasts will start to grow, and for males is their testes will start to grow. So that may be a question on the test of what would be a sign of sexual maturation. Would be breast and testes. So like I said in the earlier example, girls tend to start puberty earlier. So they start their growth spurts at age 11, where boys tend to start at 13. So that's why you have those classes where maybe the girls are taller for a long period of time and then they come back and the boys shoot up. So that is kind of a typical age of beginning puberty. Now, as we know, not everybody is the same. Some are late bloomers, some are early bloomers. So it doesn't mean just because you fall out of these ranges that you're abnormal, but this is just a typical average look at that. If you think back to your adolescence, when did you, notice these things? And it'll help you remember the age group that these began. So this figure is showing the signs of physical maturation. So you can see on the left is average inches of growth per year, and on the right is average pounds gained per year. So there is an increase in height and weight, and there's changes in body fat and muscle. Right? Women start to get curves, guys start to build out muscle, right? Those are one of the key signs of puberty. You start to get secondary sexual characteristics, you get body hair and growth of breasts and testes. Like I said, girls start at 11, as you can see in this figure, and then you can see how that starts to taper off through the year. So you can see that those peaks between 10, 11, 10 and 16, and then it starts to taper off. So girls start at 11, they reach their peak at 12 and mature by 15. So those are the average numbers. So know these numbers. Boys, right? We said they start later because they tend to be late bloomers. They tend to start at 13, peak at 14, and mature about 17. So that 2-year difference in growth spurt can lead to awkward social interactions, right? So that's one of the questions we asked in our objectives. How can physical growth, affect our psyche? So think about it, when you have, the girls are 3 inches taller than the boys, maybe that's going to cause different social interactions, right? And if the girls are more mature, they've already started to mature and have those hormones and the puberty, they may, be a little bit more physically mature and maybe psychologically mature as well because of the language and as we've learned through the rest of the semester that they've developed. So 11 and 12-year-old girls often are taller and look more mature than the boys. So just remember that girls start earlier, 11 they start at 11, reach their peak at 12, mature by 15 on average. Boys start at 13, reach their peak at 14, and mature at 17. And then you can see that, as they start to age, we don't grow anymore, right? We start to max out and plateau, as you can see in this figure. And again, with our weight, we're supposed to max out and plateau. We don't need to gain weight because we're going to reach our maximum height. So remember those figures, and I want you to think about where do you fall into these categories? Were you hitting them about the same time, or were you a late bloomer or an early bloomer? And we're going to look a little bit at that and how that affects our interactions with each other. So remember, between 6 to 10 years old of age, they average about 5 to 7 pounds of weight gain a year, and they grow about 2 to 3 inches a year. And at the peak of adolescent growth, a girl may gain as much as 14 pounds in a year, and a boy as much as 16 pounds in a year. So what happens after, all this growth? What characteristics, what physical characteristics do boys and girls have now? So after adolescent growth, boys generally have more strength, speed, and endurance than girls. They tend to accumulate more body mass. Body fat increases more rapidly with girls than boys, along with heart and lung capacity. This is why boys are stronger, quicker, and have better endurance, because they just have more, they have better lung capacity, they have more muscle mass, so they're geared to that. And women and girls put on the more the fat increases for preparation for pregnancy and stuff. So those hormonal changes, those bodily changes, to think about what thousands of years ago, what the environment had us doing, right? The men were hunters and women, stayed at home. So some of that is in our DNA, right? We are made men are made to be stronger and more muscle mass, and women are made to have children. So that's just that starts to happen in puberty. But not all body parts mature in the same rate. So I want you to picture adolescents, picture these kids, and what do they look like? Are they nice in proportion? Looking good? No, their bodies are out of proportion, right? They look gangly. Teens have a head and hands that are too big for the rest of their body, right? Their body has to catch up. So you want to remember, body parts don't mature at the same rate. Head, hands, and feet begin to grow first. So this may be on the exam, just a heads up. Head, hands, and feet begin to grow first. followed by the arms and legs. So they may have really big hands and this little body, right? Their head might look really big on their body. Their feet might look big, but they haven't grown into their shoe size, right? So then it's followed by arms and legs, then their trunk and shoulders are last to grow. So then they could fill out, like their chest starts to fill out, get that muscle mass, and women start to develop breasts. So kind of think of it like that: head, hands, and feet, then arms and legs, and then trunk, shoulders are last to grow. So things that we want to look at in adolescents' brain process information more quickly than children's. So what do you think that? So what we've learned from synaptic connections, right? So the more that you stimulate the brain, the more environment you have, the more you're exposed to, the more that efficient the brain becomes, and more the faster the speed of those connections. So the more that you're exposed, the more that you practice something, your brain starts to process more. So something about the adolescent brain, let's take a look at it. Brain is nearly full size, but being fine-tuned. So once you think about the adolescent brain, it's basically almost the size that it's going to be as an adult. And right now what it's doing is we're fine-tuning. We're making all those little small adjustments. So on processing, and you can do that faster, and they're taking in so much more of their environment. They're learning so much about relationships, about physical coordination, all those different things that they're learning. They're fine tuning. So when you think about the adolescent brain, the size is almost like an adult, so it's a fine tuning phase. And two features of the brain development that begins in early life are nearly completed by adolescence. So something, remember way back in our first lecture, we talked about myelination and synaptic pruning. So we're going to bring it back. So remember that myelination is the fatty padding around the nerve. So when I use that example, if you have that wire, like if you were take the wire out of the wall, it's that, the black tubing around the wire to make the electricity go faster. That's what myelin is, that fatty cushion around the nerve to make it go faster. Well, by adolescence, you have almost all your acquisition of that fatty insulation that makes the neurons transmit information faster. So it covers almost all the nerve, and it makes it go faster. So that's one of the reasons why their information processing is faster than that of a child. And then the second thing is that synaptic pruning. So remember when children were learning things, they had all these little, they had basic ideas on things, but when they learn something more advanced, the brain is efficient. It just cuts it eliminates those synaptic connections. So what it's saying now that the brain is fine tuning, it's really becoming way more efficient, and it's lessening its synaptic pruning because you're fine tuning it into the brain it's going to be. So once it's weeded out most of its unnecessary connections between neurons, it can be, have much more full idea of the brain. It's getting much more closer to an adult brain. So the two things that you want to remember is that myelination is almost completely completed in around all the neurons by adolescence, and that synaptic pruning, because they're fine tuning, that is starting to reach its development as well. And just remember that different regions in the adolescent brain are well connected, and information is rapidly conveyed between them, allowing them to process information much more efficiently than children. So they've got just better connections, and the regions can connect faster and better connections to all the regions of the brain, and that is why that they can process more efficiently than children. So in this figure, you see that on the bottom is age in years, and on the left-hand side is functional maturity. And what we're going to talk about is this gap. Why is there a gap between how old you are and your functional maturity, and why does it increase in adolescence? So what this figure is showing is that there's a vulnerable time between the reward and pleasure seeking centers of the brain. So that's your limbic system. So when you want to think of your limbic system, it's that reward and pleasure seeking area. And when do we are most likely to see that? Are you going to see that in your 60-year-old, or are you going to see that in your 15 or 16-year-old? Right, you're going to see it in that teenage years because it's not as developed. You can see that gap right there. So what it's saying here is that as it matures more rapidly than your behavioral control, so the limbic system, that pleasure seeking, I want it now, I want to feel, is maturing way more rapidly than that frontal cortex system, which is saying, trying to hold you and to limit those, make your reasoning. It's your inhibition place. So if you can rein you in on those bad decisions and say, maybe in the long term going, and driving without my seatbelt isn't a good idea. Or maybe in the long term, I should not smoke that cigarette with my friends. That's your frontal cortex. So in this diagram right here, you can see, if you look at age at about 10 to about 20, there's a big gap in that. So that's when you're going to actually see, if you actually come into a little bit between 10 and 15, so maybe about 13, you're going to see that there's this big gap in adolescence when our pleasure-seeking areas of our brain kind of takes over, and our reasoning and our logic kind of goes to the back seat, because actual physiology, that limbic system matures faster than the frontal cortex, which would limit that. So brain systems sensitive to reward, especially peer reward. So in adolescence, they're always looking for that peer gratification. Can you think back to that? Who did you want to please more, your parents or your peers? Right? So that brain system sensitive to reward reaches maturity in adolescence. So that's that limbic system. Self-control, not fully specialized until adulthood. So that's that frontal cortex. You're going to want to remember that for as we go on and we actually get into young adulthood, because it's still developing. So some of you right now, if you're 19, 20, you still don't have a fully developed frontal cortex. Your limbic system is still developed faster. So you still may see some of those traits, and everybody develops at a different rate. But that does not fully mature in the brain until you're into your 20s. So why would this be a problem? Why is it not a good idea to have a rapid limbic system development over a frontal system? So exactly, some of the things I talked about earlier, some of those risky behaviors, depending on the person and how much that is developed, could really get you in trouble or get you hurt, actually. So if you're anticipating rewards and pleasures of risky behaviors, and sometimes they just overwhelm your ability to suppress that desire, if you just don't have that frontal lobe developed enough to suppress that desire, you can engage in really risky activities that may, harm you or lead to death. So that's why you see so many, accidents or car accidents or poor decisions or deaths in teenage years, because of this decision making, of that limbic system. We don't have the maturity in the other part of our brain to bring that in and bring reason to some of our decisions. So do you guys remember the second part of of puberty? So the first part was physical body growth. And the second part, sexual maturation. So that also takes place during puberty. So when you think of that, I want you to think of primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics. So what is the difference? So primary sex characteristics are the physical signs of maturity directly linked to the reproductive organs. So that would be the maturation of your ovaries, the uterus, and the vagina in girls. And in boys, the primary sex organs are your scrotum, your testes, and your penis. So think of primary as the actual organs. So they're the actual, the ovaries, uterus, and vagina, and the scrotum, testes, and penis in the boys. Secondary sex characteristics are physical signs of maturity, not directly linked to the reproductive organs. So when we think of that, so in girls, right, we talked a little bit about this earlier. So this isn't an organ, but the growth of our breast and the widening of the pelvis in preparation, for childbearing. In boys, what can you think of? What do they change? Maybe their voice change. They start to get facial hair. So facial hair growth, widening of the shoulders. Those are two big ones for boys. And then for both of them together, they both get body hair. So maybe hair under the armpits, more body hair on the actual body, maybe on the abdomen. And the changes in the voice and skin. So what do teenagers go through? Acne, right? Big case of acne. And that's one of those secondary sex characteristics. So having skin changes, one of those things that going through puberty causes. And then the voice change. So we have the boys that start to get those high-pitched voices as that voice matures into a deeper adult voice. So just remember the difference. Primary means actual organs. So what are your sex organs? Ovary, uterus, vagina in the female. Male is a boy is a scrotum, testes, and penis. And then secondary are just think of all the things that you went through in puberty. All those you got body hair, you got breasts, you got wider in the shoulders, wider in the pelvis, and then just remember that both get body hair changes in voice and skin. So remember that changes in primary and secondary sexual characteristics occur in a predictable sequence for boys and girls. So what that means is that you're going to have one before they have the other. It doesn't go out of sequence. So for girls, they begin puberty with the growth of breasts and then a growth spurt. Menarche is the beginning of menstruation, and that happens at around age 13. Girls have a breast growth spurt, appearance of pubic hair, and then menarche. With boys, they begin puberty with the growth of testes and the scrotum. So spermarche is the first spontaneous ejaculation of sperm-laden fluid, and it's at about 13 as well. So these are just averages. So, some people can start as early as 9, as late as 15 or 16. Where do you fall in? Where do you remember falling in that category? So boys' predictable growth characteristics are growth of their testes and scrotum, followed by pubic hair, growth spurt, and growth of penis. So it's predictable. So you're not going to have one out of the other. Early menstrual cycles are usually irregular and often without ovulation. So the egg doesn't usually come down the fallopian tube for fertilization in the first cycles. And irregular means they just may not have one every month. And for boys, ejaculations are often with relatively few sperm to fertilize an egg. So they have low sperm counts. So that's that 13-year-old sperm and menstrual cycle. So you want to take away from this is that primary and secondary sexual characteristics, they come in a predictable sequence. So you want to know that sequence. For girls, it's the breast growth spurt, appearance of pubic hair, and menarche. For boys, it's growth of testes, scrotum, followed by pubic hair, growth spurt, and the growth of the penis. So remember that sequential order. It's predictable. So we learned about the signs and symptoms and what is puberty and, what is the primary and secondary sex organ. So we know that we're going to see body growth, we're going to see sexual maturation, we're going to see muscle mass, we're going to see all that. But why? Why do we start puberty when we do? What triggers it? How does this all work? So what causes the physical changes that occur during puberty? Well, there's many reasons here, but the first one is the release of hormones. So those hormones can trigger that growth of those primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So what does the pituitary gland do? So I want you to remember, the pituitary gland is in these school years, adolescent years when they're going through puberty, it is the quarterback. It is the rule maker, the play caller. It is going to trigger puberty. It is going to make the rules and say when this is all going to start. So the puberty gland in elementary school years, it is the key player. What it does is so we're going to start its first place. It's going to start puberty. It's going to signal the adrenal glands to release androgen. So we're going to make that play. So that renal gland, the adrenal glands are the receiver. They're going to get that ball from they're going to get that information from the pituitary gland, and so they're going to say, okay, the play is to release androgen. That's the first sequential step. Remember, predictable order that puberty is going to begin. So if we know what's the first thing that happens in puberty, you're going to initiate the changes in body hair. So you're going to start getting just more body hair on your body. That's the biomechanical changes that, through that release of androgen, produces body hair, because we know it's predictable in a sequential manner. So let's review that again. So in girls, it's body hair. Then a few years later, it's the pituitary gland is going to signal the ovary, so it's going to do a second play. So it starts out, maybe you're 11, you start noticing more body hair. By age, in a couple of years, maybe 9 or 10, you start noticing that. And then 11, you start to notice that the pituitary gland signals the ovaries to release estrogen, which then causes what? The breast to enlarge, female genitals to mature, and fat to accumulate. So that's all in preparation for maturity into an adult to be able to have a child. So it's predictable. So the pituitary gland first signals the adrenal gland, and it says, okay, hey, we're going to start puberty. Release that androgen. So first thing in boys and girls, body hair, just more body hair in general. And then it waits a little bit and says, okay, we're doing pretty good. We're going to release the next call, and I'm going to go to the ovaries for the girl, and I'm going to tell you to release estrogen. That's mostly a female hormone. And then the boys, I'm going to tell them, okay, signal the release of testosterone. So when we think of testosterone, we think of it more male characteristics of increased muscle mass. People take testosterone like it's a steroid when they want to increase muscle mass. Not a good thing. But you think of testosterone, you think more to the male. So male genitalia to mature and increases muscle mass. So that's kind of happening, in the same time frame for girls and boys. So together they get released from they get the body hair, and then they get around the same time they're going to get that, the pituitary gland's going to tell the ovaries to release estrogen, so they can start causing breasts to enlarge and the female genitalia to mature and fat to accumulate, and the pituitary gland in boys is going to tell the testes, so that's to release the testosterone, which is going to have the male genitalia to mature and muscle mass to increase. So one key thing: who is the trigger for puberty? What is the gland that's a trigger for puberty? It's a great test question. Who's the quarterback? Who's going to make all the calls? So that's the pituitary gland. And then they call, who does he call? Who are his players? He's got the adrenal gland for both boys and girls. And then in the females and the girls, he has the ovaries. And in the males, he has the testes. So first, he goes to the adrenal gland and releases androgen. And then a couple years later, he goes to the ovaries and the testes and tells them, release estrogen for females and release testosterone for males. So, but who calls the plays? It's the pituitary gland. So I want you to remember that for the exam. Another thing that causes, that affects puberty is genetic influences. So I want you to think about it. I know when you started, your puberty, you went through these changes. Did you start at the same time as your mom or your dad, or maybe your grandma or your grandpa? Did you follow that heredity kind of trend? So for an example, a mother's age of menarche is related to the age that her daughter will experience. So I know that's true in my family. Early starters, so my mother, my sister, me, so all that. So think back to when you did. Is that true for you? So I definitely know I have a genetic influence. So some of that, it plays a part. So it doesn't play the whole part, remember, but it plays a part. And then also is environmental factors. So Adequate nutrition and health care causes puberty can cause puberty to occur earlier if they're not met. So if you're not getting good nutrition, I know for my experience when I was young in high school and I ran cross country, I know of the girls that were very physically fit and had low body mass, they either stopped their periods or stopped their menstruation or they never started. So that was a trigger, that was a stress to their body because it was telling their body they weren't getting enough fat on their body to stimulate that. And so you can imagine other factors if the child is not getting enough adequate nutrition and health, it can cause the puberty can cause a stress to occur earlier. Um, and they just found that menarche occurs early in girls with chronic stress. So more likely in girls who are depressed or have harsh punishment as preschoolers and young children, that it just may activate the hormones that trigger menarche. So a lot of things can cause physical changes during puberty. So pituitary gland, so definitely the pituitary gland, it's the signaler, but genetic influences can trigger that to happen earlier, and as well as environmental factors of poor nutrition and health and chronic stress in those stressful environments. So we talked about the physical part of it, the physiological part of it, but what happens to the psychological part? So this is a picture of the girls looking in the mirror, right? So they're seeing their body change. They're not a child anymore. You're seeing the physical features change. You're looking more like a woman. Society's maybe making you having pictures of young girls look more like women. What does that do to you psychologically? What does that do to young girls, young boys when this image of their body is not quite an adult but not a child anymore? What does that do psychologically? So what they found is that young adolescents are often quite concerned about their appearance because it's changing so much. And what happens during this time frame? Who are their relationships with? So mostly their peers. So there's a lot of comparison between their peers judgment. So a lot of worrying, do I stack up with my peers? Am I, do I look like them? Am I, do I not? Have I not started? Am I early starter or, am I a late starter? All those factors go into it. What they found is that girls worry about appearance more than boys. So if you took a boy and a girl and you asked if, if they cared what they look like, who do you think is going to care more? A girl. And what does the media portray? Does the media have boys, pushing all this body image on boys? No, girls get a lot of that because they're feeding into that the way we develop, that we care more about our appearance. We are looking at that more. And girls are more dissatisfied by their appearance, especially if appearance is a frequent topic of discussion among friends. So again, it's that time where friends are a huge influence. So if their friends are talking about appearance or making a huge value in appearance, then they're going to worry more and they're going to stress out about it more. What they found is that peers have little influence on boy satisfaction with looks. So girls take a lot of value in what their peers and friends say, but boys don't on their appearance and looks. So boys don't care. If the boy says that shirt is ugly, they really don't care. Whereas a girl might have an internal breakdown. Have you experienced that? Have you seen that in youth or maybe when you were growing up? That boys just, they really don't care. They mismatch clothes, hair all out of place. Boys don't going to look at each other and say, oh my gosh, your clothes don't match. But girls, right, we pick up on that stuff. We're very heightened to it, of not just others, but of ourselves. So sometimes we become hypercritical of others because we're hypercritical of ourselves. And then we just perpetuate that pressure. So they find that, that the girls definitely are much more worry much more about their looks. But what they did find that boys were unhappy with looks when they expect to have an idealized, strong, muscular body, but do not. So boys are more when they see maybe other boys that have developed into, maybe they've gotten muscles and they've gotten bigger and they're more mature, they look more like a male. They may be more self-conscious or harder on themselves when they're still skinny or or maybe they've gone the other way and they're overweight, when their bodies don't match this idea in their head of that, the strong muscular, maybe underdeveloped or overdeveloped body. So they're more on that than what they, just looks in general. So it's more the body composition. So we know that hormones trigger puberty, but do hormones cause all this moodiness in adolescence? So the answer is no, it's not the primary cause. So when we think of an adolescent, so what are the main things that maybe you've heard or we think of? All this moodiness, right? Just snaps at stuff, maybe, 1 minute happy, 1 minute sad, and there's no rhyme or reason why they're feeling this way. So, and a lot of times you may hear, that old wise tale that, oh, it's those hormones, it's those puberty hormones. But actual research says, it's not the primary cause of moodiness in adolescence. Instead, what they found is that changes in activities in the social settings actually affect mood more than that. So, think of what we just talked about with the, our body image and our body changing, and we're trying to fit in, and we're trying to become, the children trying to become adults, but they're not adults. So all that can definitely affect mood. What they found is more than actual hormones. So good mood when with friends, maybe a bad mood in an adult regulated setting, because they just, they can't adjust yet. They're not quite an adult. They're not a child. So there's going to be that pushback in the adult setting. Some girls and boys start puberty at an early or late age. So that can definitely have an effect. We talked a little bit about in the preview of the chapter. So if all your friends have already started, maybe you're feeling self-conscious, or you're a girl that has started early and none of your friends, and you're afraid to talk about it, or the consequences, the physicality of it, of taking care of it, and the changes in your body, you're self-conscious, so you have low self-confidence. And with that low self-confidence, they found that you're likely to engage in riskier behaviors. So what they found is that teens are more likely to have a change in environment or social setting than adults do, so they're seen as moodier, and that girls start early trends to be more depressed, less popular. So if they start that earlier, if they're, if they tend to be more depressed at an earlier age and they tend to be not as popular, you're going to see them have behavior problems, which are more likely to smoke and drink. And some of that early maturation, if they don't, coupled with depression, and if they're less popular, they're going to show that low self-confidence and then that likelihood to engage in those risky behaviors. So early maturation, we went over this a little bit, but let's look at it a little bit deeper. So girls who mature early are more likely to engage in sex and become pregnant as teenagers. Why do you think that? Well, first of all, they tend to look older, right? So they're mature, so they may attract an older set of boys. So they tend to have more relationships with older boys. They look older, but their body may physically look older, but they're not psychologically, they're not mature enough to handle that relationship. They're ill-equipped to handle the emotional demands of a relationship, and they may be pressured into having sex by an older male. So their body may be physically ready, but their mind isn't. And a lot of times that they're with older boys that are, because they look older, but they're not ready. So a lot of times they have teen pregnancy. And what we learned early on, that teens that have are pregnant, right? They're going to have lower paying jobs as adults, and more likely when this happens to those who live in poverty or are fighting with their parents. So it's that combination. So, it's the environment with that physical, maturity. So if you have you mature earlier, you live in a household where you're in poverty or you're fighting with your parents, so you don't have that support. Maybe you've been attracted, you look older, so the older boys become attracted to you, more likely to have earlier sex, more likely to have a teen pregnancy because you're pressured into sex or you don't understand the full ramifications. And then you go into that cycle of back into poverty, back into that. So that's how some of the physical maturation can affect the psychology, of the child. But so if you take that same child that's early maturation, but you're in a warm, supportive household where parents offset some of these harmful effects. So maybe they set guidelines, they talk to you about, they protect you from, don't let you go out with older boys. They, you have the opportunity to do other things and, form, you're in a safe environment. So you encourage for school. You don't have to worry about eating. You don't have to worry about, um, fighting with your parents. You're in that warm environment. So even though you've matured earlier, you've had an earlier maturation, you have that parental support, that environmental support that are going to offset some of that stimuli. And what they found, and what you might have seen too, is that boys tend to transition through puberty without long lasting negative effects. So they tend to go through and they tend to not have any effects. Girls, depending, when you start and the environment, the support you have and the peer relationships you have a huge effect on, can have a huge effect on later development. But they found in boys not so much, unless there's been studies that show this is a mixed result, so not conclusive, but they have showed some studies that whether or not early maturation in boys is harmful or beneficial to their psychological well-being. And what they found is that some boys may have psychological disorders such as depression, more prone to substance abuse and to sexual activity, if they're being more physically advanced for their age. So what they found, if they mature earlier, it tends to lead to problems with peers who have not matured, so they tend to be more depressed. So if they're the early starters, and it causes them to spend time with older boys. So older boys equals riskier behaviors, and so then those are some of the reasons. So with the boys, is that if they mature earlier, because they have this depression, because they aren't having this relationship with their peers who have not matured yet. And so then again, it's causing is that again their body has matured faster, so they're hanging out with people that are older, and causing more riskier behaviors, more likely to have sex, more likely to just do smoke and drugs and all that stuff. But what they found is that just as boys just tend to have that less overall from girls, so they tend to not find anything really conclusive that boys transitioning through puberty have long-lasting negative effects, where girls, they just have more relationship, more correlation with a negative, an early maturation or negative experience during their transition through puberty does tend to have more of a long-lasting effect than boys would. So take a look at this picture. What do you see? So you see definitely a early maturing teen there, right? Compared to its peers. So that can cause some problems. But what they found is it doesn't cause, for boys, it has a tendency not to cause long-term problems. So because children enter puberty at different ages, early maturing teens tower over their late maturing age mates. So that's what you see in this picture. What they also found is that late maturing females do well. So the whole, if you're, the later that you start your menstruation and you mature, the more likely you're going to have less long-term effects. Early maturing females just have more likely to have some lingering effects in development once their adolescence is over. They found, however, in boys, that's just less likely overall to have any long-lasting effects. But if they do have any long-lasting effects, late maturing boys are somewhat at greater risk for depression, but most will likely have no harm into adulthood. So now we're going to look at health during the adolescence years. We're going to examine what are the elements of a healthy diet for adolescents and why is that important. So think about what we've learned about when babies grow rapidly. So if adolescents are having this huge growth spurt, why is it so important to eat a healthy diet? What do you need to grow? So we're going to go over that. And why do some adolescents have eating disorders? Do adolescents get enough exercise? And what is enough exercise? We're going to look at that. What are the consequences of participating in sports in high school? How many of you guys participated in sports in high school? I can say I did. And what are common obstacles to healthy growth during adolescence? So what are some of those barriers to developing correctly, to developing correct physical growth? So let's take a look and examine these areas. So think of when you were a teenager, you're an adolescent. What did you eat? What was your diet? I know me. I know so much more, but I remember I went to Bakersfield High School. We used to drive down to Wendy's. We used to drive down to McDonald's. I didn't even think, I didn't know about a healthy diet. We know so much more now. So let's think about what is important for during this important growth spurt. So let's take a look. So now let's take a look at nutrition in adolescence. So I want to take you back to your teenage years. Some, like I said, this might not be too far away, some of us longer. What did you eat as teenagers? Did you eat a lot of calories? Did you eat nutritious food? I myself can say that I didn't. I mean, I just wasn't as aware of nutrition. I went to BHS. I drove down to Wendy's. I drove down to McDonald's. I know so much more now. I wish I could have imparted on my teenage self. But why is it so important for good nutrition and have increased calorie intake? So if we think back to our other major growth spurt when we were infants, they needed a lot of calories because calories have help build muscle, help build bone, help that rapid growth. And if you don't have enough calories, you're going to see deficits in that physical growth and brain maturation. So again, we're having a huge growth spurt, right? Going to have 2 to 3 inches a year, gaining, as 1 year, maybe we learned 14 pounds for a girl and 16 for a guy. So how many calories does a teenager need to have correct and proper development and physical growth? So an average teenage girl needs about 2,200 calories per day, and an average teenage boy needs 2,700. Now that's just average, and it varies. If you're smaller built or bigger built, you may need more or less, but that's average. And you need those calories to build muscle mass, to build bone, and to build for good brain maturation. Second, so 2 important minerals that you need calcium and you need iron, and they're very important for bone growth and for hemoglobin production. And hemoglobin is the protein that's inside red blood cells, and it's what carries your oxygen. So you need to have calcium and iron. So if your hemoglobin's low, a lot of times they give you iron because that iron helps that blood protein. So many teenagers get inadequate nutrition from fast food. So just like I talked about, right? So if they're not getting the proper calcium and iron, they may see deficits in bone growth, may, see more likely have maybe fractures and stuff, maybe not as strong as bone. So it's very important that they get the calcium and iron. So inadequate iron makes teens moody. Inadequate calcium increases risk of osteoporosis in later life. So that's what I was just talking about, that increased chance of your bones being weaker later in life, so they're more likely to break. And remember, calories depend on your growth rate, your activity level, and your body composition. So those are just guidelines. And again, one thing I wanted you to remember about hemoglobin. So again, remember it's the protein matter in the red blood cells, and it's what carries that O2. And so you need iron to help with that hemoglobin production. So if you don't have enough iron, you're not going to get enough hemoglobin production. And if you're not getting enough hemoglobin production, you're not going to get enough oxygen to go to all those vital organs, go to the muscle, go to the brain, so that you're not going to be, you may be moody because you don't getting enough oxygen to your brain. You're going to be, tired and fatigued. And especially important during menstruation because you're already losing blood through the shedding of the uterus. So if you're not getting enough of that iron in your body to make the hemoglobin, you're going to have all those effects amplified. So this is important for the test. Hemoglobin is it's a protein matter in red blood cells that carries O2, and you need iron. So iron is the key to help with that production, and it's so important that especially females during their menstruation cycle get enough iron in their diet so they do not have low hemoglobin. Low hemoglobin can actually make you faint. One of the things that we look at the hospital, if their hemoglobin's below at 6, usually about to give blood, you have to be 12.5 or something around there, up to, about 14 is normal. So that's one of the big things. So especially in teenagers, how do you get, you want to make sure you get that iron so you keep that production. And so if we're thinking about, like I talked about earlier, about hemoglobin producing that O2, so why do you think boys would need iron? So to increase muscle mass, they need oxygen to the muscles. To the muscles to work, they need oxygen. They need blood supply and they need oxygen. That's their fuel. That's what makes them work. So if they have low iron, they're not going to build that muscle mass because you're not going to get the nutrients to the muscles. And then girls need iron to replace the blood loss from menstruation. So now that we've talked about nutrition, we need to address the other aspects of health. So what happens when you overeat and what happens when you undereat? So let's look at obesity. So obesity is a serious problem for American children and adolescents. It's defined in terms of body mass index, which is BMI. I don't know if you've all heard of that. BMI is your adjusted weight to your height ratio. So instead of just taking your weight, this takes into account your height. So taller people should weigh more. So it takes that into account. And what it means is that the upper 5%, which are very heavy for height, are defined as being overweight. So you can look at your height and see what your weight should be, and it'll tell you if your BMI is out of the range. And in the last 25 years, overweight adolescents has tripled. So why do you think that adolescents are 3 times as overweight as they were 25 years ago in 1993? So that's when I was 1995. That's when I was at BC. So what do you think? We've talked a little bit about this in the class so far. What things do you think would cause that? Well, we have a lot here, right? So one of the things that you guys have been bringing up in your your PowerPoint presentations is all the electronic devices and the TV. We're on our devices right now. COVID, right? We're on them all day, taking online courses. But children are much more inside and on their online devices. How much are children really on their devices? When I was a kid, we didn't have that. We barely had one TV, so we played all day outside, right? We didn't have those inside distractions. What's another thing? Look at our diet. So, maybe 25 years ago, people ate at home more. There wasn't many fast food. Now we have fast food for almost anything. A lot of fast food diet, big portions, uncontrolled eating. Sports and athletics, maybe in the schools. Not as much PE. PE is being phased out of schools. What can you think about a problem in Kern County? Our air quality. That would be one, right? So if the air is not, how many days do you have to stay inside because the air is bad, or you can't play outside? So all these factors play a part in why we are so overweight, and 3 times adolescents are 3 times from 25 years ago. And 1 in 6 American children or teens is overweight. So if I take 6 of you right now, 1 of you is likely to be overweight. That's crazy. That's a very high percentage. So let's look at some other factors. We have heredity, parents, sedentary lifestyle, too little sleep. So we look back and we remember when we studied our genes, the heredity, the genes. So we have, we pass many genes to personality, to what we look like, so even how much we eat. So some people lack the gene to tell them that they're full. Or some people maybe have low metabolism. Their thyroid doesn't work properly. So if any of you have thyroid problems, you know that, if your thyroid is not working properly, you have a harder time, losing weight or keeping the weight off. If you have metabolism problems, you're less likely to convert fat to full. So some people that have high metabolism or low metabolism have actually had that test where they check your metabolism. And so what it does is it tells you, so it was like where you're submerged or whatever. So what it does is it tells me, so at the time, this was 11, 12 years ago, it would tell me that if I did nothing all day and just sat around, I could eat 1,730 calories and not gain a pound. So that's actually pretty good metabolism at the time. But some people may be 1,200. So everybody's different. So what is that resting metabolism? What can you eat and do nothing and still maintain your weight? Parents. So how do you think parents influence? Parents are the biggest influence, right, when they're young. So if you start developing, they have bad habits, and they are maybe you see sometimes you get the double kicker. So if you have the heredity gene and then the bad habits on top of it, so the parents probably have both as well. Maybe they can't tell, they have that gene where they can't tell they're full or they're more like a slow metabolism, and yet they still eat fast food, or they don't know how to eat nutritiously. So they're passing the gene and maybe also the habits that go along with it. So they're creating, bad habits and poor choices, and then maybe they're not as active. They're sitting on watching TV as well. So the environment the parent shows is going to affect the child. So if they're watching TV instead of being active, the child's more likely to watch TV and not be active. If they're outside being active and have the childhood activities, then that's what the child's going to know. They're not going to know any different. They're going to learn those habits early on, just like eating. If they got nutritious meals in there, they're going to eat what they're given. Kids don't go to the grocery store. The parents buy their food. So parents have total, huge control at this age. It is a very great opportunity to teach good eating habits, because if you can teach them now, it's much more likely to be a lifelong habit. And I don't know, when I was a kid, parents used to urge us to clean your plate. Nope, you can't leave any food. So what are they teaching us? So we're not listening to our bodies. We're filling our bodies even when we're full. So we're teaching our bodies that to eat when you're not hungry. And so the stomach stretches. Your brain sends a signal, like doesn't know when to turn itself off. Or we give food as rewards. Did your mom say, "Oh, if you're really good, I'll buy you a cupcake, I'll buy you a cookie"? So then instead of being hungry, or it's now a comfort. So when you need that comforting, you look to food. So bad habits. You're looking for external cues to soothe you emotionally instead of for hunger and nutrition. Another huge thing is sleep. So if you get too little sleep, why do you think that would cause you to gain weight? So one thing, if you're on your phone, how many of you have your health app? I have an Android, I have a health app, and you look at the sleep, and it'll ask you how much you sleep, or kind of estimate how much you sleep. But next year it tells you how many calories. So the more you sleep, the actually more calories you burn. So when your body repairs itself, it's making, burning calories, fixing yourself up. And also, if you're not sleeping, what do you might be doing? You might be eating. So if I'm staying up till midnight, 1 o'clock, and I'm watching a movie, I'm going to get hungry because I'm up longer. And I'm going to be like, oh, probably get some popcorn or maybe something that I wouldn't have eaten as I'm asleep. So I'm not burning calories, and I'm eating when I should be asleep. And because I'm so tired, I'm not going to exercise. So it's all those things can, affect your diet and your exercise and your obesity. Now, and maybe if you have one of these things, or maybe two of these things, it's not going to be cause for alarm because you're doing other good habits. But you put about 2 or 3 of these things together, and you're going to create a problem. So collectively, it can cause obesity. So let's talk about we talked about the physical problems with being overweight, but remember, physical manifestations produce psychological manifestations. So what are some of the things you see psychologically with overweight youngsters? So are often unpopular, have low self-esteem. We already talked about, especially with girls, that how hard we're hypercritical of ourselves, hypercritical of others, our peers, the pressure. Maybe because you can't participate in the games that they're playing, or you're embarrassed to go over, to do activities because of the way you look. All that can lead to depression, lower self-esteem, and maybe, not being as popular with the other kids. And also, obesity puts them at risk for medical problems throughout their life. So if you're obese as a child, you're more likely to have high blood pressure and diabetes as an adult. I see this all the time in the hospital now. 20 years ago when I first started out, I would see, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, diabetes, and above. Now I'm seeing 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, obese, already having multiple medical problems, end-stage renal disease, kidney problems, poorly managed diabetes, poor diet, poor exercise, 30, 40, having to get amputations, having to get surgeries. So it's definitely on the rise, especially in Kern County. It's a huge area for obesity. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you guys talk about in your PowerPoint some of the things that we can do, but it's so important that we address this because these can lead to carryover. These carry over into earlier young adult problems where they used to not manifest till later. So let's take a look at what we can do to help these children lose weight or not gain weight in the first place. So the best thing we could do is prevention. So just promote healthy lifestyle, nutrition, and prevent obesity. It's the key to avoiding a lifelong weight problem. So the best way to avoid a lifelong weight problem, this will give you a test question, is prevention. Prevention is always the best way. But if you can't do complete prevention, how do we help these obese children lose weight? We have to help change their eating habits and exercise. So what they found, so this is key, this is what you need. There's 6 things they can do to help lose weight the most effective way. So the first thing to do is change the children's eating habits. Parents, and that's why they need a lot of education. Parents need a lot of education because children aren't going to the store and buying their own groceries. They're not making the dinner. I mean, we're talking, young children. Then when they get to adolescence, they're going to start making their own decisions. But teach them how to eat healthy foods. What is healthy? Portion size. Eating when you're, stopping when you're full. How much food is, what should I be eating today? How much is too much? Teach them those good eating habits and do them yourself. So if you're in a household, everybody needs to be eating good, have good eating habits so that the environment promotes those good eating habits. You need to encourage them to become active. So find something they like to do. So if they're on their phone all day or they're on their computer, maybe find a computer game that's like active, like the Wii used to be active, and Dance USA or whatever, other active things. If they like a sport, to go out and play or, swim or walk or anything that you can do. But it has to be something they want to do so they'll continue with it. Teach them to find activities that are active that they like to do so it doesn't feel like they're exercising, but make that a part of their life. I think we need to really teach, and I find this just being in the field of physical therapy and health. How do we teach people, to be, lifelong, that exercise is medicine. Exercise is part of your health. So just like if you can get active and keep that, if you want to keep your blood pressure down, exercise. How do we make it change the mindset? But finding something that they like and connect to is key. So not just tell them to go run and making them do something that's negative. No one's going to want to do that. I don't want to sit on the treadmill for an hour, walk on the treadmill for an hour. I hate that. But I'd rather go play, you go tell me to play basketball or maybe do a boxing class. That's fun. I'm not thinking of exercising. So we need to incorporate that early on and have them find, things that are active that they like, that they can connect to. You want to set, number 3, you want to set goals for eating and exercise. So teach them, when I feel like this is enough food. I only need 2,200 calories a day unless I exercise. What does that look like? And how much exercise enough? What should I feel like when I'm exercising? What should my heart rate be? What is, aerobic and, strengthening? Teaching them and, educating parents and, what is, teaching them a long lifestyle, not diet, lifestyle. Number 4, parents help set realistic goals, small achievable goals that build up to a large one. You don't want to say, in 2 weeks, I want to lose 20 pounds. Because if you fail, you're just going to quit and not be successful. But maybe say in a week, I'm going to stick to my diet, not my diet, because we only say diet, but I'm going to eat healthy 75% of the time. And I'm going to exercise, 3 days at 30, minutes. That's my goal. If I cheat it, the 5th thing I can do is give myself a reward, but not a food reward. So maybe because I did so well, I did everything on my goals, I'm going to let myself, have 30 extra minutes on my computer, or I'm going to go, shopping with my friend. Whatever is something that's meaningful. It has to be meaningful to that person for them to want to continue activity. And lastly, 6, self-monitoring, own eating, and exercise. Making yourself accountable. How do you teach that? There's a lot of apps, right? There's one of the apps I've used before is Lose It. It helps you put intake what you're eating, so you can really tell what your portion sizes are, and then it puts in your calories, so that your exercise calories you burn. So if I exercise, I can eat more. So it really helps you see what food, how much food portion is that calorie intake. And so then you can teach yourself portion control, you can teach yourself exercise, so that, and then your body gets used to that and it just learns to do it naturally. So we need to teach these skills. We don't teach these skills. We just say you need diet, but we need to teach lifestyle skills on nutrition, exercise, and our body. And it starts in the home with the parents and then to the children. But even with this, even with all these things, many stay overweight because it is so hard to change a habit once it's set. So that's why prevention is so key. And it's really hard if the people you're around aren't changing with you. What they found is that teenage girls tend to worry about their weight and try diet and diet pills, which we have found, right, when we looked earlier in this class, that they tend to have a harsher self-image, harder on the way they look. Peers are harder than boys. But that can potentially lead to dangerous weight loss, anorexia, and bulimia. So we're going to take a look at the next slides on that and look at the opposite. So we're going to go away from overeating, obesity, maybe lack of exercise, to undereating and that distorted reality of what your body image is. So there are 2 common types of eating disorders, and you're going to want to know what they are and what the difference is. That would definitely probably be on the exam. So you're going to want to know what each one is, and you want to be able to compare and contrast what's similar and what's different. So what is it? How many of you felt like, I know at one time everybody has a time when they don't feel like they look their best, or, or they feel like they're at the shape that they want to, but this is taken to the severe extreme. So how do they get from just feeling inadequate to these eating disorders? So let's take a look. Anorexia nervosa is a persistent refusal to eat along with an irrational fear of gaining weight. So it's psychological. It's not, it's something that is a problem. They need help. So what happens is that, even when they look in the mirror, they still see that image. If they thought they were fat, they still see the bigger girl, the fat girl that they think they were. And they may never have even been, large to begin with. And, if we consider that obese, but their perception of their reality is so off. That's why it's an irrational fear. So even when they're skin and bones, they still see that overweight girl. It often leads to heart damage because if you think about it, if you lose weight, you lose muscle mass. Well, what is your heart? It's a muscle, right? So if you lose the actual muscle in your heart, sometimes you can't recover. Even when you started eating back, sometimes your heart is so damaged that people can die. So this is a singer probably none of you know about, maybe some older ones if they're older, a little bit older like me, but Karen Carpenter was a singer in the 70s, and she had anorexia nervosa, and she actually died from heart problems because she damaged her heart so much. So without treatment, 15% of adolescents die. So that's a huge number. It's a huge problem. Now, maybe, I don't know if one of you, maybe if you've had feelings close to this or have experienced something like that, or you've had a friend or know somebody, try to picture what that personality, what are they perceiving? It's irrational. No matter what their body image is, they already have a picture in their brain of what it is, so they can't see themselves in reality. Now, bulimia nervosa is a disease in which people alternate between binge eating and purging by means of laxatives or self-induced vomiting. So they actually eat, but they eat a lot, and then they go in and stick their fingers down and throw up, or they take a laxative to get out. So they found that they can purge a few times a week to more than 30 times a week, but they just cannot stop eating. So they may tell themselves they can, but they cannot stop eating. So the difference is, anorexia, they don't eat, they just don't eat. Bulimia, they can't stop eating, but then they throw it all up. And with that, they get a lot of trachea, esophagus damage in there because of the acids from the stomach burn and can just wear out that. So they have a lot of problems with medical problems in that area. And then just remember, anorexia nervosa has a grossly distorted body image, and they claim to be overweight despite being painfully thin. And I'm going to actually have some testimonies. I'm going to see if I can pull up the videos I had from last semester on girls that, going through treatment for anorexia and bulimia, so you can see some real firsthand accounts. So what are the risk factors related to girls for developing an eating disorder? So one is heredity, low self-esteem, mood, anxiety disorders. One of the main factors is peers and the media. We've talked about this, how much the media has a distortion of female bodies. So when we look at a magazine, is that really that person's body? No, it's photoshopped. We have screens on our phone now. Everything's filtered. Does anybody show their true self? So we're seeing all these unrealistic images, and these girls don't have the development. And even young, it's even hard as adults. We know better, but these young girls do not have the maturity to be like, that is not real. That is not what a body is supposed to be like. My peer, the pressure from their peers, friends talking about, having friends who diet or being overly immersed in a culture that emphasizes, being attractive and your weight. There's a difference between being healthy and being thin, right? Being super, super thin. So when it comes to away from nutrition and health to being where you look like and you're thin, it can distort that body image. Because remember, it's in the brain. It's the distortion of what you think you look like. So all that can come with it. And if you have a mom that has an eating disorder, you're more likely to, develop that. Partly maybe genetic and partly environment, right? You're being surrounded by someone who's still dealing with those same eating disorders. So you're seeing it, and you may have some of the genes. Most important risk factor is overly concerned about their body and their weight and having a history of dieting. So if test question. So the biggest risk factor for developing a eating disorder is overly concerned about their body. So preoccupied about their body they can barely function. And their weight, I can't eat that. Did I gain it half a pound? I'm weighing myself 5 times a day, right? That's obsessive. And has a history of dieting, always on a diet. So, those people always on a diet, obsessive about their weight. Those are a huge risk factor. So we talked about girls, but girls aren't the only ones that can have eating disorders. Boys make up to 10% of documented eating disorder cases. Now, what do you think are some of their risk factors? Same as girls, low self-esteem, but they're a little different. Childhood obesity. So a lot of times they see these in boys that were obese as a child and lost a bunch of weight, and yet they still see themselves as that obese child, and they've had a lot of pressure to lose weight from their parents, so they tend to take it the other way. So they're still that distorted picture. So remember, when you think of that distorted picture of my body, what I'm seeing of reality is not what I'm seeing in my mind. It's that distorted picture. So remember, this primarily affects girls, but boys can have 10%. With risk factors including childhood obesity, low self-esteem, participating in sports that emphasize being lean, and pressure from parents and peers to lose weight. So what can we do? How can these girls get help and boys get help? So there are programs for at-risk youth that can protect teens from eating disorders. So what is the main goal of these? So how do they help them? Because remember, it's in the brain. It's something that's distorting their body image. So how do we change that body image? So you want to teach them to resist social pressure and change attitudes and behaviors. So it has to come from having to resist what other people say and how to change their perception of, their attitudes and their behaviors. And treatment is critical for teens diagnosed with an eating disorder. Treatment is critical. Because if you don't change that perception, that behavior, and how to deal with all the pressures, then you're not going to change the behaviors. And treatment emphasizes modifying those key attitudes and behaviors. So we talked about earlier teaching children the value of exercise and how, how do we self-regulate exercise and how we monitor it. So what are we teaching them? What are the guidelines? So what they recommend is 30 minutes of exercise at least 3 times a week can help reduce the risk of obesity, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and psychological problems. So take it there. 30 minutes 3 times a week. That's only an hour and a half. Totally doable. So you need to teach that how doable that is and find something fun that they like to do. And look at how well it not only benefits the body physically, but psychologically. Exercise is a great psychological tool. It releases endorphins. It makes you feel happier, releases stress. So it's not just physically, it also helps with psychological problems. What they have found is that most adolescents rarely get enough physical activity. A minority of high school students enroll in PE. They're cutting a lot of PE classes, and the most who do not attend daily. So what was your PE classes like? Did you do a lot of physical activity? Did they teach you how to have exercise program for life? Did they teach you the benefits of and feasible ways to incorporate exercise? So I think sometimes I haven't, I'd be curious to see what you guys think because I haven't been in high school a long time. But we learned sports and we learned some of that. But I played pickleball. I'm never going to play pickleball. I have to have a special tool and equipment. That's not going to keep me active. Are we teaching kids how to do stuff that they can do at their own home to continue it so they can keep these benefits? And again, benefits of participating in sports. So many adolescents get physical activity through organized sports. Many high schools, right? They have variety of sports. I played in a sport. So yes, it promotes self-esteem. You learn initiative. It builds social skills. All those things. And you're working as a team. You have to communicate. You get confidence. You learn to initiate. So all those things where maybe you wouldn't do, you're able to do that physically first. So it brings out the social part where maybe you wouldn't be able to do it socially, but it definitely helps discipline, and those social skills because you have to work as a team. 7 million teenagers participate in organized sports. So that's a lot of teenagers. So what they definitely promote, physical activity, and they can promote self-esteem. But what else do they promote? There's injuries. What are some of the complications of participating in those sports programs? So I know if I look at the atmosphere of sports when I was in high school to now, it's 25 years ago. We had a lot of two-sport athletes. There was club teams, but there wasn't not every sport had a club. I played basketball. We didn't have club basketball back then. Now it's intense, right? Even like 7, 8-year-olds are on club teams. They're playing, one sport and they're trying to get them to specialize early. We see this in therapy. A lot of injuries early because you're doing so much repetitive same sport activity on growing bones and muscles that haven't matured to adult. They cannot take the stress. They're not made to take that repetitive stress. That's why doing other sports is good for you because it changes up the way you move your muscles and the way the forces you put through your joints. You're less likely to get injury. When you're doing something repetitively strain every day, you're more likely to get injury. And these young children's bodies wear out by the time they should be hitting their peak. They're done. When they should just be starting their peak, they're done. So definitely a big issue I know in physical therapists that treat young athletes is how do we change that culture of thinking to preserve and not get burnout and injuries. So what they found is that approximately 15% of high school athletes sustain injuries, mostly minor, but with these minor injuries can build on each other and cause other problems. Approximately 2% of high school athletes use anabolic steroids. And what that does is it, helps them beef up, muscle up, get stronger, more endurance. But it also causes damage to the liver and other organs. It's associated with mood swings, depression, and aggression. So it's definitely not a good thing. And it can promote antisocial behaviors. And most of the time that is testosterone. So I talked a little bit about that male hormone testosterone. So when they get the Anabolic steroids increase the testosterone to increase the muscle size and strength and to promote quicker recovery, more frequent in boys and younger students that want to catch up to their maybe naturally developed, counterparts, but definitely not a good thing. Damage to the, liver and organs, mood swings, depression, aggression. Parents and coaches need to be aware and show alternative methods to reach these goals. Again, all that coaching on nutrition and exercise is where it comes into play. So overall, sports mostly are positive when involved in other pro-social activities with adults, church, school, and youth groups. So there's a balance, and you have sports with other social groups, and they tend to be very positive. When it's that single-minded focus, especially at an early age, promotes more injuries, promotes more antisocial behavior, and more pressure, more likely to do some of these like stereotype things to perform these expectations at an earlier age where their body just isn't prepared to do that yet. So let's take a look at threats to adolescents' well-being. So if you remember earlier in the lecture, I talked about this gap in adolescence, the limbic gap to the frontal cortex gap. And if you remember that limbic matures rapidly. So it's that reward-seeking, pleasure-seeking part of your brain that is maturing rapidly. So that's why you see more teenagers doing risky behaviors, opposed to the frontal cortex that doesn't develop fully until your mid-20s is less developed. So your reasoning and your logic is in the back burner. So because of that, you can understand why there are more threats to adolescent well-being, because they're involved in more riskier behaviors because their limbic system is developing more rapidly, and that's that pleasure-seeking zone, than their frontal cortex, that is that reasoning and logic. So they found that every year, approximately 1 U.S. adolescent out of 1,000 dies. Boys, more accidents involving motor vehicles or firearms, again, that risky behavior because of that limbic system. And girls are more natural causes or accidents involving motor vehicles. So they're just putting themselves into more risky behaviors for that in the moment seeking thrill or pleasure. Most are preventable, like driving too fast, driving while drinking, while not wearing your seatbelt, guns, easy access in the home, loaded or unlocked. So they're just looking at that immediate pleasure seeking, and they're not thinking of the consequences, and actually has a physiological base. It's the limbic system versus the frontal cortex. So they find that with this, adolescents take risks that adults often find unacceptable, because once you hit that mid-20s, most adults have that frontal cortex fully developed where their logic and reasoning overweighs the limbic system and the reward and pleasure seeking. So compared to adults, adolescents find the rewards associated with risky behavior far more appealing. And because that pleasure-seeking limbic system is more mature in the adolescents than the behavior modification system, the frontal cortex, you're going to see these adolescents having an increased threat to their well-being because they're going to seek out these riskier behaviors. So now let's go and talk about how adolescents process information. Remember we talked earlier how that system is at the end of its maturing. Their synaptic pruning is coming to an end. Myelination is fully developed. So their processing and their information is so much quicker than a child. So if you think about how fast can teenagers figure stuff out on their phone, multitask, do all that stuff, why are they able to do that? So we're going to dive into that. So our objectives are: how do working memory and processing speed change during adolescence? How do increases in content knowledge, strategies, and metacognitive skills, so remember metacognitive skills is thinking about thinking, influence adolescent cognition, and what changes in problem solving and reasoning take place in adolescence? So this figure shows working memory and processing speed capacities and how they increase during adolescence. So if you look at the figure on the left, On the left side, you see reaction time in milliseconds. And then you see on the age on the other side, you see 5 to 23 years old. So you can see that response time declines steadily during childhood and reaches adult-like levels during middle adolescence. So you can see right about that 13 years old, it starts to even out that line. And so the reaction time is almost about the adult-like adolescence. So why? Well, let's take a look. So how did they test this? So they tested this on giving them responses, remembering things on visually, and then they had to press how fast they could press the button in response to a visual stimulus. And they found that they're about that age of 13 is when they start to reach adult-like levels. So you can see that's when it starts to kind of level out. And you can see by 17, they're almost 17, 19, they're almost exactly like an adult. So this is key. Adolescents process info about as quickly as young adults by their mid-teen years. So that would be like a test question. So adolescents process information about as quickly as young adults by their mid-teen years, and that's what that graph is saying. Changes in working memory and processing speed means that compared with children, adolescents process information more efficiently. So remember, your working memory is that cognitive system that holds your short attention memory. So the stuff that you learn right away. So you're retaining it and using it right away. It's the memory that you're using in the present. You're not retrieving it. It's the working memory, the memory you're using as you're doing the activity. So changes in this working memory and processing speed from childhood to adolescence, it reflects the maturation of the areas in the brain, the increased myelation that I talked about. So that's the increased processing speed. That's the fatty tissue around the neuron, and it allows nerve impulses to travel more rapid and more efficient for processing information, and it's nearly complete by adolescence. So when you think of processing speed, you're going to think of that myelin, that fatty tissue that's around the nerve that's letting that signal go super fast. So I always think about, whenever I think about nerves and myelin, I think about that electrical cord that I have in my wall, and that if I stripped off the black part of it, it's going to slow down the transmission because nothing is in there to help speed it up. The myelin, and just like the black tubing, helps keep all the insulates that nerve, insulates the wire, and helps speed up the transmission. And because that is complete by adolescence, you're going to get that adult-like processing speed. So let's take a look at content knowledge, strategies, and metacognitive skills. So thinking about thinking, such a high concept, right? So in adolescence, increased content knowledge allows adolescents to improve their understanding and memory, right? They're increasing their knowledge. They're getting exposed to so much more. So their knowledge base is, multiplying. So think of the environments they're in, right? They're in school, they're with their peers, they're driving maybe. So they're even going out and experiencing situations on their own. So all that knowledge is helping them improve their understanding, their memory, helping that cognitive, helping them think more abstractly, and helping them predict for the future. Adolescents often have adult-like skills in such domains such as using cell phones, which allows them to teach adults, right? How many times do you see the teenagers teaching grandma how to use her cell phone? Because they just understand content knowledge much, much better. They're getting that strategies on how to remember, how to understand, and how to learn really, really peaking during their adolescence. So this increased knowledge also allows adolescents to identify learning strategies that are and are not working. So remember when we talked way back about learning strategies, do you highlight, do you list, do you have little, naming songs for it? So they've become so proficient that they can, really identify ones that work and ones that don't. So for example, making a list, outlining, reading material. They know how to improve their memory and make learning more effective. So Children versus adolescents, so study habits. So let's take a look at that. So think about how a child would study and how an adolescent. An adolescent has better organization and better at choosing the best method for organizing their information for recall, especially with task-specific activities. They're more likely to highlight a textbook. So if I said, how are you going to, I want you to read this book and read this chapter in your textbook and let me know, give me a little synopsis of the important stuff. Well, they're going to, an adolescent is more likely to highlight and have a method to go back and look at their stuff to get that important stuff, where a child, may not know where to start or how to organize that learning process. So better at choosing the methods for organizing information, especially task specific. And adolescents also have increased knowledge, helps them identify better strategies appropriate for specific tasks. So like this fancy features on a cell phone. They have more knowledge. They know everything about a cell phone. So when something comes updated or there's a new app or there's something fancy, they have so much content knowledge that they are better at that specific task because they can apply that content knowledge and work those upgraded or fancier features. So because of this increased knowledge, they're able to apply better strategies on how to use new knowledge, especially for specific tasks. Adolescents are also more sophisticated in their problem solving than children. So if you think of a child and an adolescent, it's, everything kind of comes together. Adolescents, we know physiologically, and then we know that brain maturation, that's coming to a conclusion. They're getting all their myelin, their synaptic pruning is going, so they have the actual physiological changes. And then their environment, they're exposed to more knowledge, more situations, more independence, so that's going to affect as well. So that combination is going to allow adolescents to be more sophisticated in their problem solving because they can put those two together and make assumptions, make hypothetical predictions. So what you want to know is that children use heuristics. Adolescents use analytical problem solving. So what is the difference between them? Analytical problem solves relies on statistical information. So it's analytical, it makes sense, it's logical. Whereas heuristic uses rules of thumbs that do not guarantee a solution, but are useful in solving a range of problems. So children tend to be fast and require little effort. Analytical, which is adolescence, they determine an answer mathematically or logically, depending on the nature of a problem. So they think about it. So let's use the example, what might a 15-year-old consider before deciding on a bike to buy, opposed to what a child might decide. So the child might choose something that's simple. I'm just going to choose the bike that my friend likes the best. That makes sense. It's very fast, requires little effort. It's heuristic, right? I didn't think about it. It makes sense. My friend likes it. A 15-year-old might say, I'm going to buy the bike that is rated best by the large sample buyers. I'm going to look on the internet. I'm going to compare with the best price to best value. So they're using logic. They're recognizing the hazards. They're going to look at all the safety features. Whereas a child's like, my best friend has it. He likes it. That's good enough for me. Very simple, fast, and requires little effort. So with this improved logic, they recognize the hazards and generalizations from extremely small samples, concluding that another example would be like if a child and a 15, say a brother and two brothers were over, one was 15, one was 9, one would say, these two French people were rude to me. The little brother might say, all French people are rude. I had those two people rude to me. Because taking a very big generalization and applying it right to a whole country. Whereas a 15-year-old might say, well, only two people is a very small sample size. That doesn't mean that all of French people are rude. So they can make that logic, where a 9-year-old would just come to that easy conclusion. So that's one of the big differences between child problem solving and reasoning in adolescence. Children are simple, use heuristic, which is very fast, requires little effort, makes big generalizations that you can apply to, makes generalizations from small populations, then tries to apply it to large. Whereas an adolescent's going to be analytical, going to look at the statistics, going to problem solve, going to compare, and can make realize that generalizations don't apply to larger populations. So a key factor is improved logic and analytical thinking. And make sure you know what heuristic means, okay? So now let's review everything that we learned about information processing during adolescence. So remember what I said, when we see a table, it's a great study guide. It's going to condense all that stuff we just learned into an easy study tool. So let's look at so this is the information processing during adolescence. So it has the feature on the left-hand side and what that state is on the right. So we're going to look at first thing we looked at working memory and processing speeds. So what did we learn about that? So we learned that myelin production is almost adult-like, and because of that, processing speed is about mid-adolescence is like an adult processing speed, and that working memory is like an adult's working memory. So adolescents have adult-like working memory capacity and processing speed because of that myelin. So you remember that myelin is completely developed, and myelin makes your signal go fast down your nerve, and it enables them to process information efficiently. The second feature is content knowledge. So what happens when we become, as we age and become adolescents? Get new experiences, new environment, new knowledge. You're in, lots of new, you're in high school, lots of subjects. You're driving, maybe you can, you're definitely exposing yourself to more content. So with this content, adolescents have greater knowledge of the world, facilities, understanding, and memory of new experiences. So if you can understand a situation, you're more likely to remember it. So that's how your memory improves during adolescence. Strategies and metacognition. So adolescents are better able to identify task-appropriate strategies and to monitor the effectiveness of those strategies. But remember, adolescents are also less likely to use strategies that threaten their own beliefs. So an example would be they refuse to listen to evidence that the curfew is a good idea because they already know, I'm mature, I know exactly what I'm doing. To sound like a teenager, and you're not going to change my mind. So they're very set on their strategies, and their support is always they always have evidence to support their strategies. So instead of looking at the evidence and making a decision, they choose evidence to support a belief, and they're less likely to change that belief. Have someone change that belief. And if they do change their belief, they're just going to find other evidence to support it. And then lastly is that problem solving and reasoning. So we just went over that. Adolescents often solve problems analytically, logically. That's that key word than children, right? Children are heuristic, simple, easy. And they are able to detect weakness in scientific evidence and logical arguments. So, right, generalizations, they can tear them down. They can know that I'm not going to apply, something that two people did to a whole population, whereas a child might. But remember, these are skills that they are capable of doing. Does not mean that they do this consistently. Sometimes they do not use these tools effectively. They resort back to heuristics because it's easy and good enough for the problem. Right? They don't want to overthink everything. They're teenagers. Oh, you like that restaurant? Let's just go. Right? They're not going to say, what's the price? Is it going to be busy? They're not going to look at that. Let's just go. They're inconsistent with their beliefs. They may try to dismiss the evidence or have the evidence fit their beliefs. So very headstrong, right? They're getting these new beliefs. They find the evidence. They can't always see the big picture or, other people's beliefs. They're going to find support to fit their belief. And they use their reasoning skills selectively, right? So to fit their needs and beliefs, and they do not always use the most powerful levels of thinking. So they're not going to sit there and reason everything out. So you got to remember there's other factors coming in too, right? They have that limbic system that's really highly developing, that pleasure, So they have the potential, but they're not always going to choose the most powerful one or the right one. So what the takeaway out of this is just remember that informational processing accounts of intellectual functioning during adolescence is a description of how children and adolescents can think. So this is their potential. They have the skills to do this. But it is not how they always or even usually think. So it may not be consistent. So they have the potential, but it's inconsistently taken. So just remember that they have the potential, but it's you not always are going to or see it or even usually see it. So the last thing we're going to cover here is moral issues. And we're going to take a look at how does that adolescent look at moral issues compared to children. We talked a lot about content knowledge and the environment, the new experiences, committing to memory, how they've done a lot of psychological development of looking at themselves, looking at their peers. So how, now that they have these new reasoning skills, better processing, how do they make how do they make decisions on moral issues? So we're going to take a look at that. And how do they concern for justice and caring for each other? People contribute to their moral reasoning. The teenagers are not consistent. We already determined that. And they act in diverse ways. Some commit terrible crimes, others risk their lives for others. So they don't show a consistent across the board, moral compass. So why are teens capable of such opposite actions? So Kohlberg, who studied this he was born in 1927 and died in 1987, he asked the moral dilemma question. So this is kind of that moral, how they've studied, and we're going to go over this moral dilemma question. And what he found is that it had no correct answer. All courses of action have a desirable and undesirable consequence. So whatever you choose is going to have good things come with it and bad things come with it. So how do you make a decision? So the moral dilemma that he looked at is stealing medicine for his sick wife when he didn't have any money. So I'm going to actually read you the exact scenario of this moral dilemma. So his example is the Heinz dilemma. So like I said, it's about stealing medicine for his wife. So here's the scenario. I'm going to state it, and then we're going to go over his moral reasoning. So Heinz steals the drug. In this scenario, a woman has cancer, and her doctors believe only one drug might save her. This drug has been discovered by a local pharmacist, and he was able to make it for $200 per dose and sell it for $2,000 per dose. The woman's husband, Heinz, could only raise $1,000 to buy the drug. He tried to negotiate with the pharmacist for a lower price, or to be extended credit to pay for it over time. But the pharmacist refused to sell it for any less or to accept partial payments. Rebuffed, Heinz instead broke into the pharmacy and stole the drug to save his wife. So this is the question we're going to ask, and we're going to give lots of different scenarios. Colbert asked, should the husband have done that? Colbert was not interested so much in the answer, but in the reasoning behind each answer. So we're going to take a look at the reasoning behind it. Should the husband have stolen the drug? So as we evaluate that question, we're going to go through Kohlberg's 3 levels of moral reasoning, and each level has 2 scenarios, right? There's never a wrong or right. There's always a good and bad to each scenario. So we're going to look at the 3 levels, and they each have 2 stages. So the first one is pre-conventional level, and it's based on external factors. So moral reasoning is based on external factors. So involves obedience, orientation, believing that authority figures know what is right and wrong. So one of the things if we're looking at stage 1, we would say to that question, do we do what is right to avoid punishment? So he's avoiding getting caught for stealing or avoiding his wife dying. He's avoiding those punishments. So pre-conventional is reward and punishment. So stage 1 is should he steal the drug? Yes, he should steal the drug because he's trying to he's going to try to avoid getting caught stealing, or he's going to try to avoid his wife dying. Stage 2 is use of mental orientation. So you're looking out for one's own needs. So in general, that would be you'd be nice to others to expect a favor. So in this scenario, he would steal the drug because Heinz's wife would do something nice for him, or he's not going to steal the drug because it would cause more problems for him. So people wouldn't be nice to him for being a thief. So either way, so if he chose to steal the drug or not steal the drug, it would be because he's looking out for one's own needs, because they'll like him because he stole the drug, because they want him to do something nice because he's doing something nice for his wife, or is it because he's not being nice because he's a thief? The second stage is moral reasoning is determined by others' expectations of them. So pre-conventional is based on external factors, and conventional is determined by others' expectations. So stage 3 is based on interpersonal norms. So are you aiming to gain the approval of others by being good? Are you considered a good person? So he wouldn't steal the drug because he wanted to keep his reputation as an honest man. But then again, if he would steal the drug for the same reason, but the drugs, he would steal the drug so people wouldn't think negatively about him for not saving his wife. So they're both about him looking good, but for different reasons, right? Because they don't want to look like a thief, but then he also wants to look good for helping his, he doesn't want people to think bad about him for not helping his wife. So again, no right or wrong, you can justify either way. The second part of this level, stage 4, reasoning focuses on social system morality. So you want to maintain the order in society. So we can steal it or not steal it and still have a reason for maintaining order in society. So you shouldn't steal the drug, even though the wife might die, because it is illegal and no one is above the law. So he shouldn't steal it. But you could reason opposite way. Well, he should steal it because the drug, he needs to steal the drug because he made a marriage vow, and that's a contract in society. And he made this vow to protect his wife. So even though there's negative consequences, he needs to uphold that marriage vow. So he's still trying to maintain the order in society. Either way he looks at it, either he steals the drug or he doesn't steal the drug. And then the last level is post-conventional level. Reasoning is based on a personal moral code. So stage 5 is, so basically reasoning is based on a social contract. Laws should exist for the good of the people. If they no longer promote people's welfare, they become invalid. So in that idea, so we're going to look at it both ways. So we can justify stealing or not stealing by the same reasoning. So he should steal the drug because social rules about property rights no longer benefit individuals' welfare because these drugs are helpful and they're too expensive. So it shouldn't matter. But he shouldn't steal it because it would create social anarchy, right? Everybody would steal because they want it. So either way, he's using the same reasoning for doing opposite actions. And then stage 6 is abstract principles, compassion, justice, equality. It's forms of personal social code. So we can defend stealing or not stealing it in the same way. He should steal the drug because saving a life takes precedence over everything, including the law, because it's socially right, compassion, justice. But he should not steal the drug because the wife has a right to die, and he should not force his views on her by stealing and administering a drug she may not want. So again, social code. So this usually takes many years to progress through these stages. Adolescents are just beginning it. And it's, you can see people at different stages in this, but happens more abruptly when individuals undergo a major transformation in their moral motivation, right? Something really triggers you to have to make a decision like this. You start to go through this. Now I'm going to have the video. Now, you must watch the video because it explains. It's very hard to explain it over a PowerPoint like this. You need to watch the video, and it shows it in a animation, and it explains it really well so you can really understand, because you really want to know what Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning. So basically there's 3 levels, each has 2 stages, but it's basically you're using the same reasoning for doing 2 different actions. And that's saying that moral reasoning, there's no right or wrong, because you can basically justify either way by the same reasoning idea. Such as, so one of the examples would be the movie Schindler's List. Like, he has to go through some moral reasoning, and he justifies letting those people go probably for more of a social code, right? So he's using Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning. So Kohlberg believed that people progress through all stages in order without skipping, and younger adolescents tend to act morally only if external forces pressure them. So only if someone is pressuring them to do that. But critics of Kohlberg's theory say that this is not a representative of different cultures. So we've talked a lot about how cultures view moral code differently. So an example would be Hindu children would encourage Heinz to steal the drugs due to their religious emphasis on serving others. So cultural beliefs play a huge impact on your moral reasoning and what your decision would be. Some takeaways from this is that research supports with longitudinal studies that they move through the 6 stages of moral reasoning in order with virtually no individual skipping stages, so that is definitely supported. Adolescents who defend their principles in difficult situations tend to be more advanced in Kohlberg stages, and advanced levels are compelled to action by their moral principles. And less advanced acts only when such action is endorsed by external forces. So that's usually your children when something is made. Make them act, and the older you are, you're more likely to, like, if you're going to go, like we're seeing now, the people protesting, or that's a moral decision. They're more likely to be proactive on it as they're advanced in their levels of moral reasoning. And again, like I said, moral reasoning, it reflects the culture in which a person is reared and what that culture values. So more students don't speak up for the wrong because they are at the earlier stages and there is no reward, and violate social norms of ratting out your peers. So if you're at that earlier stages, that's usually pre-conventional or conventional level, and that's usually around a student of 8th grade. So when you see that, you think about that 8th grade student, they're mostly going to be in that pre-conventional or conventional, and more students don't speak up for the wrong because they are in those earlier stages, and they just no reward for sticking up for them, and it violates the social norm because nobody else is sticking up for them, and it's the social norm. We don't rat out our peers. So when you think about adolescents, think pre-conventional or conventional levels and that 8th grade student. So this is a picture just like we're talking about the protesters. And this is a time, we're seeing a lot of this moral code. So you think about what's going on in the world right now. I mean, could you apply some of this of Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning to what stage they're at, and how they could justify what they're doing? So teenagers who engage in moral behavior such as participating in protest marches often reason at higher levels in Kohlberg's theory. That makes sense, right? That last level is right, social justice. So look at this picture. I want you to think about what stage are these group of students moral reasoning do you think they are in? Something to think about. So does Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning apply to males more than females? So Carol Gilligan has talked about this, and according to her, females have an ethic of care, and males focus on justice. So it goes back to how our attributes and stuff that we've started when we were young. That she's coming off that ethic of care, where females just tend to care more. She says they tend to just have a more empathy maybe and care more about others, where males are more on justice, right or wrong. But what they found in actuality, that males and females reason about morality in similar ways. Justice and caring come into play depending on the nature of the moral dilemma and context. So it's more based on the actual dilemma than if you're a male or a female. Gilligan, she believed that ethical care leads females to emphasize fulfilling obligations to other people, and those obligations fuse their moral decision making. Both have moral reasoning of justice and caring, depending on the nature of the moral dilemma and the context. Most cultures want parents to encourage adolescents to think carefully about moral issues, and children need to be exposed to good moral reasoning to progress. Parents need to have discussions of these is the best way to promote moral reasoning with children. So this is a really good time in the world, right, that we can talk about uh, how do we come up with these decisions? Maybe not tell them what to think, but how do you think? How do you make these decisions so that you can have a good background on making good moral decisions and good reasoning and good evidence? So just remember, Gilligan believed that females had an ethic of care and males focused on justice, but research really hasn't shown that. And they found that males and females reason about the same. It's more the nature of the dilemma and the context of the dilemma that shapes the just and caring aspects. And so we see here, according to Gilligan, moral reasoning is driven by the need to care for others. So that ends chapter 8, adolescence. So we went over a lot: puberty, physical growth, sexual maturation. We learned that information processing. We learned all that, the moral reasoning. So look at the videos, extra videos, but especially the Kohlberg extra video is required. You're going to want to watch that to learn, really see the examples come to life. I'm going to have an anorexia, bulimia video on there. I want to show some examples. Remember, those are free game for the test. Use them for your discussion group. You're going to have your attendance assignment, chapter 8, your homework quiz, and your discussion group. Feel free again, if you have any questions, email me, and I will see you next week.